Anyway, Bill came, and that freaked out a bunch more people, so we lost more people. Because Bill was, I remember a guy told me, I can't follow this man because he cries when he preaches.
Wow.
Yeah, Bill is super emotional. I mean, you don't see it a lot, but it's boiling underneath. So he'll get to talking, he'll choke up, and he'll wait for a minute, and then he'll finish his sentence. And this other guy just couldn't handle it. He thought, the guy's way too emotional. Wow, because it felt like I could totally follow Bill. I knew it right away. Both Donna and I, we knew we could follow Bill. But then there is the interesting dilemma that emerged is Bill then, once he started, he began to bring over his team, which that's totally right to do. And he assembles, Chris Valentin and Danny Silk and Charlie Harper and a couple of others you wouldn't know, but he began to pull these people over, and their conversation was, we are called to serve Bill Johnson. Especially Chris. He still, to this day, has anyone heard him say?
Oh, yeah.
So he has, he's probably articulated it best, but others have as well. Paul Manwaring, when he emerged eventually and came to kind of favor in there, he had the same language. I'm called to serve a person. And for Paul, it was Chris, it was Bill. And I'm being quiet over here because I'm like, I feel called to the organization. And I don't know how this works, but it feels right. In fact, to be honest, it was right for me. And so what I found is my call. So you're listening to me describe I'll tell you the series of how things went from there on, but my lens was always an assignment. It felt like from the Holy Spirit to build and protect the organization and migrate it from something to something different. From what I call mom and pop organization, which is very personality driven, oriented around a person, to something that was organizational. And I later learned that, and this was probably in 2017, 16, 17, right in there was something beginning to stir in me that I was bothered by. My conclusion is the organization was moving past organizational and going institutional, which in my thinking is another level. Not a bad level, just a different level. And I didn't feel called to that. So I was, if I step away from my time at Bethel, which was 21 years in the end, I realized that I had a passion and a conviction to stay, even with the conflicts and difficulties, because there were a ton of them. It's very behind the curtain. It's a pretty rough environment. Not. It's like here's a bunch of big opinions, big strong personalities, and they're moving in a direction, and they are not. Those personalities don't stop to pastor injured people. If I can say it that way, they are looking for strong people because this is what we're doing. And so to be on the team, I learned right away that, wow, I have to learn how to patch up my own wounds and kind of get over myself and get on this team so I can run with this team, because the Lord showed me I have a place on this field. So imagine a soccer team on a field. We all have our positions, and I have to be a play every time. If you can imagine, the ball's moving around. I have to always be a play, even if the ball is on the other end of the field. I have to be ready for my part, because if the ball comes, there's no passengers on the senior team. So I'm talking about now the senior team experience. So what that would look like for others in other places in the organization. So the core team, there was 12 of us, and we became really tight, really conversationally and accountability-wise tight, and visionarily tight. Visionarily, there's a new word. But relationally, like friendships were not, I didn't experience that. I think the team did in the core. It's almost like David's Mighty Men. There was the three, and then there was the, how many was it? 30, and then there was these rings and rings of mighty men. And I think that, Bill and Chris and probably Danny experienced that very, very tight friendship level. Beyond that, we felt very, very, it was a wonderful thing. We felt very on purpose. We knew we were there and called. We knew God was using us. We all knew that we didn't really know what we were doing. No, it's true. And we tried to understand it, and of course Bill was amazing at teaching it, and Chris as well, but we all recognized that we were all an experiment. It was very much an experiment. So in my observation now, so I've been out of Bethel as a staff person for about 2.5 years, coming on 3 years. So that's over 24-year period, I observed the organization was denominational, then it became mom and pop, or kind of small local mentality church, because that was when Bill moved in. That's what he brought from Weaverville. Weaverville was a very small church in comparison. Then it grew to organizational. That for me was, we have systems, we have assignments, we have staff and delegation, we have people driving their ministries without the input of Bill or the senior leaders. And then it began, in my opinion, it begins to move institutional now. And institutional for me is, I began to observe the distance between, so we used to have this thing, we would make a rule, but we always reserve the right to change that rule. It's like, we have rules, but we are led by ideal, right? And that fit well in this organizational model. It fits naturally in the mom and pop model because a small organization is all just kind of spontaneous or organically led, right? But the organization began to have pains, and so let's build it out organizationally with structures and assignments and departments and divisions and layers of authority and reporting systems and all of that. That was this organizational piece, but we still were able to preserve. I'm really, really happy about this. I felt we still protected around really delicate things like the budgeting. We still built it in a way that it was very nimble and flexible. When that nimbleness began to stop, when we began to hear, hey, I really need to, I know that the rule is, but I need an exception because I have this thing I'm doing, and more the answer was no, we can't do that. It was like, that's not us. What's going on? And so that experience I began to observe that. At the highest level, I saw it long before anyone. I think that's a true statement. And so I felt, something is shifting here. What's going on? So there's a part of this story that I'll leave out unless someone cares, but I had a personal transition, what I call a pivot story, of how I navigated this piece that I'm describing. Is that fair? Mm-hmm. But for you, unless you ask, I'll just explain the organization. I did step away. This was in 2016, I think it was, somewhere in there. And it took me 7 years to do that. So to give you an idea of the length of time and the planning and the strategy that went in. So built it up, built lots of systems that were able to handle organization. See, the thing had grown so big. It went from about 35, 36 employees when I started to 600 employees when I left.
Wow.
So what used to be a manual payroll system was untenable at 200 people. And so when we got to 400 people and we're still doing it manually payroll, it was like, this is dumb. Plus I'm thinking inside, I'm probably going to step away from this thing, and I need somebody to be able to carry it. I don't want to leave something that's just wreckage. And so that's what we did, and we did a lot of system integration, And I was really pleased with that. So when I stepped away, I trained a second person who was my replacement. She did manage, her name's Vicky, and she's amazing, and she did manage that position. You know? She just resigned, too.
I know that.
Yeah. So she has now moved on, but for great reasons. She got a great offer. But yeah, so that's kind of the systemic thing. If you look at it for 24 years, you see in my thinking kind of I really think the denominational thing isn't wrong or evil, but I think it's very institutional, and so I feel like it's kind of gone back. It's not a denomination now. It's still a beautiful place, and I love it. It's my home church, but I recognize, whoa, this isn't too far different than what we started with, and it feels, okay. So I reserve my opinions on that. I'm just participating and supporting that. But when the organization went kind of to its low spot, we're denominational, we just lost our senior leader, and now we have no leader, and the organization is kind of slipping in size, momentum, and esteem. And it took us 6 months. We hired Bill Johnson in. Bill came and said these great words that we all love. I'm all about revival. I'm all in. If you want revival, then you want me. If you don't want revival, you don't want me, because this is all I'm doing. He tells the board this at his interview. And we all celebrated, we want revival. And so, until we got him, okay. What did we do? And so that's Bill, and he begins to be Bill, and he begins, I remember his first message was, I believe his first message was Generosity, a Military Move. And I think it was a 4-week series, and he just taught on generosity. Reading is, historically, you probably heard this story, it was called Poverty Flat back in the 1800s. So it had a lot of poverty thinking embedded in the city. I personally think it's still there, but
Sure.
It's definitely shifted at quite a bit in quite a bit of areas. But nonetheless, this is what Bill did, and when he starts teaching on money, that freaks people out. When he's talking about revival, that freaks people out. Toronto Vineyard was a big deal then. That scared people, including me and Donna. But then Bill began to assemble his team, and he did a really interesting thing. As leaders, you'll appreciate this. He didn't replace his cabinet, all the senior team that were there. What he did is he prayed the ones away that needed to go. It was really weird. I mean, he directly talked to us about that. There were people on the team, one by one, they would recognize, I don't think I belong here anymore, and they would vote themselves off the island. And I think it's time to move on, which is exactly where I'm at. It's like I could tell my season is past. This is me done. And so it was neat because and I knew these guys. These were the guys that I was working with in those days. A guy named Alan Ray, who's a great pastor, deliverance guy. And then he just realized, I think I don't fit. I think I'm going to move. And he pivoted his life, and he ended up down in Southern California. He's still down there, and he's doing his thing. Another guy I believe is in Canada, or Colorado. Let's see. Well, there's so many coming back to mind. It doesn't matter who they are, but it was interesting how Bill's approach was very non-confrontational, but he would take that thing to the Lord and watch people respond to the Holy Spirit. I think is what was happening.
That's awesome.
Amen.
I think it was amazing.
Yeah.
And especially as a person on the team who, you see the tradition would be new president, new cabinet. So, okay, let's clean out, thank you for your service, you guys are gone, but here are my players, and you would vote them in. And what was fun is, as an old cabinet member, I was voted in. And it was like, I was allowed to stay and win my place, is what happened. And I felt I did. So it was really a wonderful time. But literally, it was so weird. I remember I'd go home and I'd go, Donna, I think Banning, his time's coming. Or I feel like there's another guy, I can't think of his name now. Oh, it was the senior leader, or the youth pastor before Banning leaves. His name is Scott. It's like, Donna, I just feel like Scott's done. And literally within 2 or 3 months, they were giving a notice. It was the weirdest thing. And so that transition took time, but that was going on as we were kind of on our low spot. And then the organization began to grow. Grow looked like we went from, let's say, my experience there was probably 2,000 people in size. This is denominational time. When Bill left, we probably lost in 3 or 4 waves, meaning when
Bill came.
When Bill joined, over that period of time, there were probably 3 or 4 waves of people leaving, and each wave would be 200 to 300 people, maybe 400 people, something like that. So I think the organization, in honesty, was probably maybe under 1,000. That means that who actually would come on a Sunday was probably down in the 200 range, something like that.
Wow.
200 to 300 range. And I think more people were around, but they were kind of watching and seeing, and sometimes they'd come. You know how that is. There's always a bigger membership than there is an attendance usually. And so that wave happened multiple times. And I remember there was a little dynamic. There was a lot of. I'm sure everyone was navigating this, but my wife and I navigating the renewal thing, especially. You know, the laughter, and I don't know why laughter is such a weird problem for people, but it was for me. I'm like, wow, could God be that happy? You know, and all of that. And, you know, we didn't want to be deceived, and so I hope this isn't a cult, and is this really God, and all of that. And so I had some cool interruptions from the Holy Spirit to teach me about that, and that convinced me, like, okay, this is Jesus. And I'm sure the whole team was going through that. But then, once we passed through that, so this probably brings us from 95 up through probably 98, the organization actually started to grow. And grow just looked like there were renewal meetings in Reading. They had moved to Bethel, so they didn't start at Bethel in Reading. They started at a vineyard church, pastored by a guy named Mark Balick, and who's, I don't think, pastoring now. But anyway, it was actually at a vineyard. And so Bill would have us go over there and attend those meetings just in support, but also to learn. They had people like Stacy Campbell, Wes Campbell in, and I remember Stacy Campbell specifically because, you know, looked like Cousin Ed with her hair to her feet. She's prophesying like this with her head going. I was like, Jesus, this better be you, because that doesn't look like you right now. That was so weird. But yeah, and then it began to happen. It began to grow. The ministry moved back to Bethel Church, or to Bethel Church, meaning the renewal meetings on a Sunday night, and those began to gain traction, and people began to come, and of course they were messy because a lot of, you know, it's a new light, and a lot of moths and stuff would come, a lot of weird people, and expectations, and people acting out, and all that mess was there, but we had this clear observation that there was, in the middle of it all, there was a distinct ring. I always thought of it like the ring of a bell, the sound, you could hear it cut through all the noise, you know? Mm-hmm. And there was all the noise of people misbehaving or not understanding or being nervous and falling out or just weird behaviors. And then you would have the person, you would see a person genuinely changed. Like board members that we knew were really stoic and just not very happy people. I have 2 in mind. One of them was Cal, who's often spoken of. Cal Pierce, you know, and his wife Michelle. And they were not happy people. They were on the board, long time board members. And they got just plastered by the Holy Spirit, knocked down, laughter, just idiots of themselves. And what got out of that, what came out of that, and they were completely different people, changed their lives around, went and started the Spokane Healing Rooms, and that's what they're still doing. Yeah. So you have those things, you're like, there's definitely some authentic in this. I'm not sure where it always is, but we can definitely see there's a genuine thing in this. And that just began to grow, and Sozo Ministry, Randy Clark, Healing Rooms, the familiar with now. Bethel Music and Brian wasn't a thing yet, but Brian was leading, and he and the whole worship team back in those days. It was just really, really intimate, really tender, not too polished, but it was really genuine.
Yeah.
And that was enough. And so that's what we had. We held on to that. We eventually labeled that thing, that genuine innocence, naivete. And I mean, that's probably what it's called. But we recognized that Bethel had a naivete that was, innocent and silly and beautiful. And we recognized, we don't quite know how that came about, but we're going to hang on to that. So we fought for that thing, naivete. We still, I don't know if they still talk about it, but we often got to the point where it was a language we would use in senior meetings. Where is that naivete? If we found ourselves migrating, getting too important, too professional, too polished, we would say, where is that thing? Oh, there it is, so let's not do this. And so it became one of the ways we would navigate decision making, like how we would run meetings, or how we would invite, or how we would host events, or just how we would do things. So that brings us up to probably 2000.
So how'd you get started doing what you do now?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I was about, let's see, 90, it's probably 90, let's see, so probably 98 or 99. I wanted to teach financial principles because I observed that there was a vacuum of, okay, so my history is financial training, right? So I at that point had been a CPA and an auditor and a trainer for probably 7 or 8 years. I step out of that professional universe and I walk into this church universe, and I realize there is a presumed, and accurately presumed, innocence and value for purity, like financial purity, in the body of Christ. But I also realize they rely on that to the extent that they're crippled. They're like, we sabotage ourselves. It's like we have the two arms, of skill set and integrity. We rely on integrity, and we just say, well, we don't really need skill set because Jesus will help us. And that bothered me because that was my place on the wall, so to speak, on the field. That was my position on the field, was to defend and say, look, we all know we're not lying, but the auditors don't, and their job is to prove that we're not lying. So we have to build systems to prove that we're not lying.
Yeah.
And the answer would be, well, we don't need to prove that, we're not lying. And I'm like, they don't know that. Oh, this is ridiculous, So this was my life. So we would go around and around building this. So it was around 99 or 98, I forget. And I started a class called Prosperous Soul. And some of the materials over there, some of that's my oldest stuff. And it started out with, I think I had 3 couples, and I just sat in a little room. I remember it was 5th grade class, or 4th, maybe less, and we had those little tiny chairs. It was so dumb. I'm teaching Prosperous Soul, and we're all sitting in these little teeny chairs with our knees up around our chins, and I'm so embarrassed, but those are my friends, and I'd never taught, so it was just a chance to start talking about things. Like, I remember the first message was roots and fruit, and that's the one where it's really a sozo tool. It's where what are the lies you believe about money? What does God say is the truth? Pull out the lie, put in the truth, and feel how that changes the way you think and process around money. And so that began the Prosperous Soul material, and I taught that. It became kind of a regular piece of the adult ed curriculum, but in those days we had no adult ed system. It was just, hey, Steve's teaching a class. It was still very organic, disorganized. But yeah, and so then that material grew and grew into what it is now. But yeah, that's where I was trying to take my experience between the skill set experience and the kind of the spiritual dynamics of living in this environment where, we're very spontaneous and we're faith-oriented, but how does that work with the financial need to steward and be accountable? How do those things fit together? So that was my space, and I began to build words around that. So that's kind of the arc. I mean, the thing grew and grew. By the early 2000s, we started thinking about building wings on, and then Bill had a dream to build another campus, and then we fell back from that campus to build multiple locations, and the organization began to spread because of our footprint. We began to move locations around, and we ended up with 4 or 5 locations around Reading. Then multiple services, and we had to split off. We had some legal risk management we had to manage, so we began to take the organization, which was a church, and split it into other specialized corporation forms. So we had 4 corporations at one time, and that enabled us to do some really cool things legally. And that was my job, is that I want to build an armored tank here so that it can't be assaulted by legal measures. So that was my deal. So we engineered all that, and of course the whole time the growth of an organization, sometimes an organization, take Nike shoes, let's say they get into a whole new branch of things, maybe television, or they build, who knows what Nike might go into. But when they build a new product, that will grow the organization based on the new product. So the core organization is there, but they have a new department to build out. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Well, Bethel was doing that. Another way an organization will grow is when it's new and its products are gaining popularity, and so it's a growth challenge. And so literally, the organization, it isn't a new department, just the whole organization has to scale for demand. So Bethel was also growing that way. We're also growing in size and depth because of the scaling. We're going from, remember our payroll every 2 weeks. When I started, our payroll was, I think, $15,000. In other words, that $15,000 plus taxes would pay for all the employees and their payroll taxes to the federal government, right, in the state of California. That was when I started. When I left, that number was, I think it was $600,000 every 2 weeks. It was staggering. Just the volume of cash rolling through the thing was, it was like I learned to look at numbers and not comprehend how big they were. It was just, these are numbers, and this is how I have to do it. And so we managed it. I know we never lost paychecks, meaning we never missed paydays, but we did have times when the cash was so short that the senior team down, we would start at the top and elect to delay cashing our checks. And that, I think in my time, we did probably maybe half a dozen times. Maybe it was a dozen times in 20 years, but we would open it up to the organization itself, to the staffing itself, and say, if anyone can postpone cashing your checks, do that. But if you need it, don't even question it. You come in, here's your check. So there was never, we won't give you your check. It was always, you can have your check, volunteer if you can, and tell me who you are so I can calculate when the cash is gonna clear the bank. It's really scary times, man.
Yeah.
And man. And the cash that it was potentially bouncing was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, so it was just wearing me out. It was a really, really tough time. I remember that year. One of the things I did is I did a lot of projections, so I was attempting to, based on where we are in the kind of the heat of the organization, where I could kind of say, okay, it looks like in 12 months we're going to be, and one day I went to the board and I looked and I worked and I worked, and I finally went to Chris and I I said, we're going to be $1 million short this year. This is hard cash flow, guys. I'm not talking, we're going to have lost $1 million. We are going to be overdraft by $1 million.
Oh my God.
And he's like, what? How's that's impossible? I go, well, we better hope it's impossible, but here's what I'm seeing. At the rate we're going, to see, this was the thing, and this is the tension between the spontaneity and faith movement. Movement is the wrong word. What is that? Just that beautiful thing that I love.
Yeah.
That whatever that is, that spontaneity and willingness to follow. And really, every opportunity, every door that opens, oh, let's run through that. So we had kind of that crow and a shiny thing. You know, I don't know what that's called, but it's like, oh, we're here, we're here, we're here. And so that gone to seed. So if I would read those and hear those and calculate it out, and I had systems and where monster, horrible spreadsheets I would do this with all, and I would come out and say, okay, we're going to be lemmings in 5 weeks. You know, we're going to jump off the edge of the cliff. And so that became my job, was to read the signs and interpret what that looks like, and then give that information. It's almost like a translator, like a whisperer, a dog whisperer or something. I got to whisper or explain that in terms that Bill and Chris, I'm not saying they're foolish or stupid, I'm saying their brain is in another place, and I had to put it into their language, or they just wouldn't value the information. And probably half of my time at Bethel, the first half, or it was probably less, but anyway, some period of time, oh man, it was just killing me, emotionally, physically, because I was bearing under the weight of this stuff. And finally, the turning point for this lesson, and the lesson is this, that I should rightly only carry what my responsibility and my anointing is for, and give the rest freely, no matter the consequences, shift the rest of that responsibility to those who have that anointing. And so I was carrying the responsibility to understand and interpret the numbers of an organization that is running like an octopus on 8 legs all over the place, and then inform Chris and Bill. But from that point on, I should have stopped, and it took me years to figure out, because I would keep carrying that responsibility.
Sure.
And nobody asked me to, but I just did. And where it occurred to me was in a meeting. It was much like this, and I was sitting listening, and Bill was talking about this exact subject, and somebody asked him, how do you deal with the pressure of growth and the financial pressure of what you're doing? And his answer was, I just have a gift for it. I just have an anointing for it. God's given me the grace to carry this. I'm sitting over here with my hair falling out.
Well, that's why you're bald.
Wait a minute. Yeah, that's exactly why I'm bald. And I was like, hello, you're not feeling it, because I'm feeling it. And the Holy Spirit said, who told you that? To carry that.
Yeah.
Oh. So this was an example of me learning how to patch up my own injuries and get back on the field. It wasn't, I need to go correct Bill. It was like, dude, what am I doing? I walk up to the point of information. My assignment is to read the tea leaves and then say, here's what I see coming. And Bill's responsibility to go, oh, Father, what are you going to do about that? And once I learned that, a huge weight of responsibility came off of me, and that
So
probably gave me another 10 years in that place. So that's kind of the migration of the thing, and all the way up to current. We started to get into visions of let's build a second campus, which was always a dream. I didn't share that vision. My vision was we have too many buildings now. They're not full. Let's fill the buildings we have. In fact, I personally was thinking we need to go online and digital and not do brick and mortar. This doesn't even make sense today to me. But that was an example of me and others with very different opinions on a team that needed everybody's opinions. So it it wasn't a fact that I need to be agreed with, it was I need to be heard. And getting heard, for me, was enough. And you say, I think this is dumb. And they would go, why? And I would say, these reasons. And they would go, or nah, or, what do you guys think? Maybe we would table this. So we had all those scenarios would play out in the senior team meetings. And those are why the senior team meetings were pretty rough. I mean, they were, when you stepped out and said, I disagree with something, and we were all expected to do that. It wasn't a yes man arrangement. It was like, if you're not making noise, then we're wondering, why are you here? And so, when someone, the risk was, once you made some noise, you were now in the ring with Chris Valentin. Oh. And so everyone else would go, oh, awesome, it's Steve today. But we all had our day, Dan Farrelly or Danny Silva, all this. It's like, oh, I'm off today. Drink coffee and lunch. It's totally, USC. It was body slams, all that stuff. So all of that would go on, and it's a true thing that is taught. I've heard it taught about brave communication. That message is through Dan Farrelly. If you haven't heard that message, I think it's a must hear. Yeah, it's an absolute key pillar, I think, in the psychology of Bethel as it was growing. That message later, not related, Danny Silva came up with his own, the culture of honor, which I value that, but I really think the core, and for me the most important lesson, came out of the brave communication message, which is very old now if you go find it, but it's still there. It's such a great thing. And Dan Farrelly, who is the most amazing communicator I've ever met, even better than Bill, I think. You can imagine that. It's just different than Bill. Yeah. Bill is an apostle and Dan is a teacher, so Dan approaches it differently. But brave communication was around, I have to find ways to communicate, to confront with my brother and not trigger. This is my translation of it. And if I'm triggering, I need to get big enough to outgrow that. I need to get over that. I need to find out, why am I, all of a sudden I'm yelling, and all those defense systems that trigger because I'm insecure right now or threatened, that all needs to go away. Brave communication is a condition where, in my mind, it became a condition where I could come to you and say, I love you, I disagree with this thing, and these are the reasons why. And when you disagree back, I can hear you. I can still hear you. I can lean in. Might be tough, but okay. Well, wow. I hear your point. Okay. But I still think you're wrong. Whatever we're going to do, we can be buddies. We can be men together in confrontation and not blow up with my flesh's responses. And so that was super important to me, just privately. I'm a very soft person, and others on the team are very, I don't want to say hard, but just very strong, driven, high D personalities. Chris is obviously one, but he's not the only one. And so on the senior team, we would be at the table, and you have these personalities. The loud ones would talk first, and the quiet ones, and there was a bunch of us as well. Dan is one, Charlie Harper's one, I was one, Paul is one, Kathy Ballatin is on the team. She was very quiet. The louder ones, Danny Leapshire, Chris. Bill is a loud one, but he does it quietly, if you can imagine that. He's
got a hammer.
He's very quiet. He's listening, and then he would. I know it's in the spirit. He has such authority, but he would. I still see him do it today. He'll listen, and it's like all the brothers are. Well, we're gonna blah blah blah, and we're gonna, and then Dad would go. Well, here's what we are gonna do. Okay, I heard you all. We're not doing any of that. We're like, that's totally right. Yeah. It was like, that's totally right. He did this to us so many times. It was so weird. One time I'm in a meeting with, this is when I first started, with Bill and Chris, now the three of us, and we're trying to solve some financial problem. And I explained it out, and and then I stop. And Chris takes over. He's going to convince Bill of what our plan is. So Chris and I talked, and I'll say, well, I'm just going to explain what's going on. And who knows what it was, you know, we can't afford our pledges this month or whatever thing we had going. And Chris said, okay, we're going to blah, blah, blah. So Chris lays out his plan, and Bill is quiet through the whole thing. I saw him do this 100 times, but this time was the first. And he's listening, and he's genuinely listening. He's, okay, processing. And then Chris gets done, and I'm looking, Chris is looking at him, and Bill goes, well, I think this, and he begins to explain what's going on in his head, and he's addressing Chris, because it was Chris's plan, which he was changing. And I'm sitting over here realizing I'm a trained accountant, and that's the stuff I learned. Now, I don't know how you know that, and I can tell you don't really understand it, but in the spirit, it's like he had this well that he could reach down, Jacob's well, and pull out wisdom.
Whee!
It was awesome, man. And that thing would happen over and over again, and he would pull it out, and we'd be like, that is the right, that's amazing. How did you do that? That's crazy.
Wow.
And I saw him do that, probably not to exaggerate, 50 times in 20 years. It's just like, wow. And so maybe that was me observing something he's taught too, is about, he's like the 6th generation pastor on one side, and 5th or 7th on the other, something like that. I think that generational heritage, that's how it looked to me as I was watching him dip into something that he didn't learn, but he had it in his heritage somehow.
Wow.
And that's super cool, man. So that was actually a point in my life when I started looking around my life, and I realized my heritage is devastated, because I don't know my grandparents are dead. I don't know anyone on my dad's side. My dad's relationship when I was busted up, I gotta fix that. So it just oriented me to something, observing, wow, this is how this works. I've never seen legacy before, and I'm looking right at it. And then I was thinking about Eric. So when I was there, I knew Earl. Earl is Bill's dad, and was pastor at Bethel for a season. Left to be a presbyter. I think he was superintendent in the assemblies, and another pastor came in. That pastor left, and then Bill came back. So that's the Bethel church history around the Johnsons. Of course, Bethel's much older than that. There's a whole bunch of people before this, but so I got to know Earl. I was working with Bill, and I was observing Eric. Now, he was a young man growing up then, but I was like, wow, I've never seen legacy. This is totally new to me, and I just fascinated me. Gave me something to aim for. Yes, sir.
How did Bill create an environment where you were felt free enough to contribute? You said like you were in the room, you were expected to bring your part, and
Yeah.
without the fear and the insecurities, he had to create some sort of an environment for you to be able to do that.
Yeah, so the person that actually made that happen was Danny Silk. Because Danny Silk was the relational pastor and kind of the umpire for us as we tried to figure out how to confront and not offend and not divide.
Yeah.
So Danny, I give the award to that. But Danny learned that, I believe, back in Weaverville when Bill taught a thing, unpunishable. I don't really like that, but that's the way Danny teaches it now. Now, Bill taught on his team, if you failed, you were not rejected. You had to fix your mess, but you were not rejected. And the most powerful lesson I ever taught was Chris Valentin teaching back. He was teaching about when he was first ministering, and he got an opportunity to preach. I think it was on a Sunday, and Bill was in the audience, and Chris preached, and somehow he really botched it. I don't know what he did, but maybe he offended somebody or something. I can't imagine doing that. But, and it was his story. It's just beautiful. But what Chris's story is when I walked off the stage, I knew I'd screwed up. So he had it, he took the risk, tried to do a preach, really crashed and burned, felt crushed over it. That Tuesday, Bill invites him to lunch, and they come to lunch. And Bill was saying, hey, you kind of screwed that up, didn't you? Chris was like, yeah, and they were processing about how to fix what he did wrong. And then at the end of the lunch, Bill said, would you like to preach this next Sunday? And Chris's report was, no, I've disqualified myself, because in his mind, he performed and failed. And in Bill's mind, no, you're a person of value, and you screwed up, you gotta fix that, but you're still a person of value, so you can fail and not be cut off. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and so I don't know how Bill built that, and really, he's not some, sage, not some secret amazing, I mean, he is amazing and all this stuff, but I think Bill, it was probably realistically, he just needed a bigger team. I mean, probably his motivation wasn't any supernatural thing. I think he was just, no, I want Chris to speak, and I want to give him another try. Probably just that deep.
Mm-hmm.
But he articulated it, and it came to Chris as, I'm accepted, I get another chance. So he goes right out, galvanized his relationship with Chris, no doubt.
Yeah.
Galvanized that, goes out, fixes his mess, gets back up, and does it again, and does well. And so that, the ability to fail and not be destroyed, I think was a Weaverville characteristic that when we moved to Bethel, Danny began to train and teach us how to do that in our environment. And really I have to also award Dan Fairley, who was the one in the room who would go, we haven't heard from Charlie yet. What's Steve thinking? Wait a minute, what is Kathy Valentin saying? And so it was a team effort, and it wasn't, a lot of the things that turned out beautiful at Bethel, it's my observation, was not intentional. It's like we stumbled into something like, wow, that really works. And that is that naivete thing. We need to do that one again. And it was trial and error, a lot of boo-boos, but I think people look at Bethel now and say, man, you guys did it all right. And we did a lot of things right, but we screwed up a lot of stuff too. We hurt a lot of feelings, and we learned how to fix that. And there were big, huge battles in the back room that nobody knows about, and those all happened. But it wasn't all intentionally outlaid like some master plan inside of Bill's mind. He doesn't know, he doesn't really care. The truth is, I think Bill has some of the least ambition of a leader I've ever seen in my life. He has no interest in, I think this is my language, he has no interest in building the company or the organization. He just wants to have revival. He just wants to see people touching Jesus. And so Bill began to pull around him his weak spot. And so he doesn't have any interest in the financial arena, so I was a shoo-in. Steve's my guy. He has no interest in confrontation. Chris loves it. So
That's a gift, man.
he actually is a gift of this. Yeah, it really is. He's good at it. Danny Silk. If you go back to the Weaverville days, you see Bill pastoring. You see a team around him. Danny's not in it. You see Chris is on that. You see Chris being taught by Bill. You see Chris has an outside business. You see Chris hire a young guy named Danny Silk under him. He's working under Chris. You see Danny gets connected to the church through Chris and begins to grow around this person, Bill and Benny. You see Danny decides, I need to grow up and get a career. He goes and joins an organization in Reading that is a social service organization. They pay for a master's program. He gets a master's degree. He moves back to Weaverville, and Bill leaves. Danny's devastated, and Danny gets his degree and moves back to Weaverville and goes on staff, so now he's above Chris. I missed that piece.
Oh.
You see that?
Yeah.
So Chris is now working for Bill and Danny, and others. But anyway, that structure happens. Danny's there for a short time, and Bill resigns and moves to Bethel Church, and Danny is so furious at Bill because I just finished my degree, I've moved here, and you leave. I'm pastoring church. I don't want to pastor a church. I want to be the counselor guy. So Danny is an unhappy leader in this church now, and then Bill plucks Chris out of the world and brings him to Bethel. So over time, Danny wants to leave and come to join the team, and he ends up working under Chris. And it wasn't long that Danny fixed that, and it became Chris and Danny. And so Bill, Chris, and Danny, and really it became Bill and the whole senior team. And then over time, it became Bill, Chris, and the senior team, because as Bill traveled more, so, just to say that the emperor has no clothes, Bill isn't a saint in that he's like some supernatural person. He's an absolutely beautiful man, but he does have his limits. He would sit here and say it. Yeah. One of them is was a help in the beginning. Remember I said he didn't confront us about quitting his cabinet. He would pray us off. Turned out later to be a bit of a problem because he was avoiding confrontation. Mm-hmm. And he would let the older brother, Chris, do it all. And then Bill became very absentee. He was gone. We wanted him to go, support that. But you end up with a missing father relationship and a dominant elder brother relationship. And then the defender of the siblings is Danny. And so you get this friction between these two strong personalities, and Daddy's gone. And then they work it out, or they do as best they can. Bill comes back, and he has to drop the hammer, and everybody goes back into their corners, and we all feel safe again until Bill leaves 2 days later. And then we all come out of the woodwork, and who are the strong personalities. So there's a lot of that weird, unhealthy family type dynamic going on that we were working our way through. You had a question in the back, so.
You more or less answered it I was just wondering how you worked getting the religiousness out of organization, church.
How I
to
did
where, well, the group, because too often, as a group, religion thwarts moves because, we can't do that because we're Christian, we can't. But in reality, when I first learned to paint cars, I screwed up, and I had to go fix them because customer's they stepped out and went, what the heck is that?
Yeah.
Oh crud, I gotta go sand that out and repaint it.
Yeah.
So in that learning process, now there's that dynamic of, I know immediately it's like, oh crud, I don't put another coat on, sand it down and repaint it because I know immediately it's there. And in that, the natural field of employment, of career, but how did the organization, the church, get over the religiousness? Because you said people were allowed to preach and teach.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the first time I ever got to spoke in front of a group for a teaching session of something religious. I don't even know if I finished it. I was gagging, puking, just.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Oh God, I can't. But with that, because there's huge dynamics in that, because with what my wife and I are working on, orphanages, religious funding of people, it would take $1 a month from each of you. This orphanage would be beyond funded, but getting them to realize not to slough it off. It's only $1, I can skip that.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, they won't miss my dollar. But in that religious, how is the group able to view that and allow people to, hey, do it again? You screwed up, but hey, do it again.
We had an advantage in the early days, and that was we came up with this term, shooting our sacred cows, this phrase. And it kind of became a culture that changed, by the way, but in those early days, we would do things that, we would value things that, that broke down that religious structure. Like,
Okay.
if a church was threatened with flags, we would wave flags and hit each other in the face backs. You know, it's just crazy all that. But we would be like, this is awesome when we hit each other in the face with flags because that's not religious. It's us shooting our cows. And so Bill was being a hunter, you know, he'd play with that. And so we as a community began to value, literally, it was a core value of ours to not be religious.
Okay.
Now, we even went so far as, I remember a lot of dialogue around this one, this will be delicate one, but when the School of Ministry first began, the debate was, do we allow them, the students, to drink alcohol or not? And the decision was, we are not going to make that rule. Our conclusion was, you should not, but we will not legislate that. Your job as a student is to manage yourself. Now, I think that was an echo from that thing I was talking about a while ago. We learned to manage ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and so I learned as a member of this community, you know, I can't go fall into an adulterous relationship. I mean, I could, but I won't, and I have to manage that.
Right.
I can't steal, I can't embezzle. I have to manage those things in me. And so I built my own code, right? And nobody said when I started Bethel Church, they said, Steve, you're not going to steal any money, are you? And I went, well, you know, okay. So we're going to do these lines around you, Steve, so you don't steal.
Right.
And so the same lines in drinking, the same lines in probably smoke. I don't know. I don't smoke. You know, I don't know about that stuff. But I just remember in the School of Ministry that debate, do we or don't we? And so the conclusion was, that's a religious boundary that we are not going to legislate.
Sure.
We're going to expect the students to keep it. We will educate them in that, but that's how we would do it. And that's just one really practical example. I don't know if it's a good one, but it's a practical example of how we engineered the culture. Whenever we saw something that was religious, oh, Christians don't laugh, we're going to laugh like hyenas. You know, let's all laugh. You know, let's just laugh about it. And so we'd have whole messages. Let's just stand there and the pastor never even said a word. Just, and we're all like, we're all like a bunch of fools, you know. And
And with that, you obviously have come through.
yeah,
Because
so
I still hear people who have never viewed an entire message, who have never
yeah.
witnessed anything about Bethel. I mean, almost, oh God, you can't do anything with Bethel, they're evil. So where did you get that?
Well, we are wild. It's true. We
Well,
are.
yeah, but God,
We are
Jesus was
a
wild.
messy ox. We're messy oxen, and there is a messy stall around us. That's really true. But I
Can we
think,
open up some, oh, sorry, go ahead and finish. I just wondered, there was a question about, can we ask some questions about some of the financial stuff?
oh yeah. Well,
So-
and I thought this afternoon I just want to focus on that too. So,
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
But let me just land this, and then we'll go to wherever you want to go. But what was an interesting thing is we began to build almost this is probably too strong, but almost a pride in our lack of religion or religiosity. Okay, became in those early days. It was like, this is kind of our jam. We're not those Baptist guys. We love the Baptist guys,
Sure.
but we're not that. We are this whatever we were.
Which becomes your religion.
Which began to
Yeah.
see what happened is Bethel began to grow in influence in the States. And what happened is our influence was being affected by our wildness. So what happened is two core values were beginning to grate on each other, and we had to begin to coach ourselves. I remember when we first introduced Bethel TV and we had live video of our messages, and so we had to literally coach. I mean, it sounds silly and we can all laugh and smile, but this was a real thing. We would do a Sunday, and then we would talk about it on the following staff day. This isn't the senior team meeting, this is the pastors all together, the staff team. And we would talk about, we probably shouldn't say that on TV, You know, so how are we going to communicate our message and not use those words because it's really offensive to some of our audience? And we began to look at ourselves like, wow, that's kind of religious. But what are we going to do about it? Because we feel, I think in those days this is accurate, you know, we feel called to influence a culture, not just our little footprint. And we recognize the wild stallion is fun. It's almost like we were teenagers, but now we kind of grow into this responsibility, and so it's like we swing back a little bit. So we were, you know, let's say denomination, we're very religious. That's a little harsh because I love the AG. I don't mean it bad, but we were just, you know, it was ties. Women have to be in dresses. We had the whole thing on the stage, blah, blah, blah. When we broke away from the assemblies and Bill Johnson was introduced, and renewal, we really swang into kind of that wild stallion space. And then when our influence grew, we found ourselves self-managing ourselves back to kind of whatever we are now. You know, I mean, I still think it's a ton of fun there.
Yeah.
But that's how we did that. And then in the financial space, that I think I was trying to hit on your question in the financial arena when I was talking about building it to an organization that was flexible. So, for example, we build a budget, and I knew that the budget was, you know, if nothing changes, which we know by, it's only, you know, 11:30, that's going to change by 12. But right now, based on, this is our best plan forward, and it cash flows. That was always my concern is, can I keep enough money flowing through to keep all the systems running? And whenever someone would change, I remember one year Bill said, do you remember, oh gosh, it was some huge stadium event down, I think it was the Call in LA.
Azusa now?
Azusa now.
Yeah.
It's this big event happens. Who's the guy that ran that?
Lou Engle.
Lou Engle, yeah.
Lou comes and, you know, this is what I want to do. You know, and he's talking about it. And Bill's sitting there and he's inspired and he says, just spontaneously in the staff meeting in front of Lou, we're gonna pay the whole thing. We're gonna underwrite the call. And I'm like, what? And so,
Whoa.
so it's like, okay, so my information is to quantify that, come up with a reasonable estimate of the millions of dollars Lou Engle can spend, you know, on this event, and then inform the team of if this organization flexes like that, here's what we're cutting off. This piece that we just left costs us this. We can't afford these 4 things, which were in our plan when we first built it. And so that's how we built flexibility in. My job wasn't to say, no, we're not doing the call, or we're only gonna do a $50,000 underwrite. That wasn't my job. My job was to say, based on what Bill or Chris or whoever and their dog just decided, these are the things that are gonna change, this is how we're gonna do it, and this is what we have to sacrifice to get there. And it might be like, you're gonna have to raise money, and which was taboo, and our was like, all right, we're not raising money, we don't raise money to Bethel Church, we don't ask. See, we would teach the tithe, we'd talk about generosity, but we would never raise money in the early days for something we wanted to do. That was a big migration. There's a lot of dynamic cultural shifts that have happened in thinking in the organization over the last 10 years especially. And some of those thinking are some of the things that I just didn't feel I wanted to go to because that was different. It's like, that's not my thing. I don't think it's bad, it's just, this is my territory, you know? So anyway, that's how I think I answer that. Navigating and stay away from the religion structure, keep it organic and flexible, keep it responsible.
Sure.
Somebody else? How long do we go?
Till noon.
Noon?
So,
Oh, great, I'm hungry. Yes, sir.
We have a mom and pop church,
Okay.
in your words, good description,
Yeah,
out in the boonies of Central Oregon.
yeah.
And, my question is, we have a budget that's been only a few years,
Okay.
and,
Congratulations.
so, budget under $100,000.
Okay.
And so what are the top couple, piece of advice, tips that, for that organization, we don't need to, organizational is, we need to move there in some areas and we
Yeah,
have,
slowly,
you know,
yeah.
slowly and remain nimble, like you say,
Yeah.
I've always been nimble, very, very nimble.
Yeah, nimble's that's just great, and I love that.
And the Lord has blessed us, since I've been there 12 years, we've never wanted for any money.
Mhm.
I've been, Keith is on our board and,
Okay.
that sort of thing, so top, things you would say to a
Yeah,
church like
well,
ours.
I think the first thing would be to, there's a principle that's in the scripture where Moses, I think it's Moses, determines leaders of hundreds and fifties and tens or
Yeah.
something like that. It's been a while since I read that, but I think that there's a principle there that is the migration from the mom and pop to the organizational. So I think that it is a natural, healthy place to move. The reason is because it protects the leaders. So the mom and pop are so powerful because you've got one or two, maybe more, key, powerful, influenced, and anointed people, and they are able to lead a community, and that's probably where most churches ever go, which is beautiful. I mean, I say that as a compliment. That's all that's needed. But the risk in those environments is these people get tired. And because they're doing so much. And I've been in probably 3/4 of the churches I go to, there's this one multitasking couple that are super talented, but when we get away over lunch, this is like Ohio and different states I go to, and even internationally. When we get away, the pastor and his wife, the wife who is having trouble smiling anymore, who has a nice persona, but inside she's feeling either really angry or really empty. Doesn't even have the strength to be angry anymore. So you got that dynamic, or you have the husband who's just like, man, I'm just so exhausted. And I can't. I just had this experience in Brazil, and this were an American couple that were pastoring a church in Brazil. And he just told me privately. He said, I have no peers. I have no mighty men. I have the people I lead, and I have the community, and I love what I do. But I'm so exhausted. I don't have anybody to talk to about the fact that I'm struggling with my marriage, or not that he was, but it's just I have no brothers at arms, equals. So I think that my number one message would be moving in increments to the organizational model, which I think is biblical, but doing that in ways to free up that pastor and preserve them. See, I think that the long game is what we need to run for. We need to finish well. I'm wanting to do prosperous soul ministry, my wife and I, until we are so old nobody wants us anymore. We're just like worn out and ugly, and not be really amazing for 5 or 6 years and then just be so burned out or pissed off. Can you say that here?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh my gosh!
We'll pray over the house.
To just, protect ourselves. So I would say protect yourself is the number one thing, and you can budget around that. Like, in other words, you come up with a concept, and I'm going to teach this tonight, I think. Maybe tonight. I don't know. Somewhere in my life, I'm going to teach this. But the kind of the alignment of a life that pulls versus a life that pushes, and how much more powerful pull is rather than push. And so when you're a leader who is a tactician, tactic meaning very task oriented, very detail oriented. When you are a leader who is a tactician, it's like you're pushing the train instead of pulling the train. And organizational enables a leader to move up the food chain, and I'll explain what all this is later, but move away from tactics and get up into the purpose end of pulling. Why are we doing this? And Bill is a natural at this, and that's why he's such a great leader. Even with his weaknesses, he is probably one of the highest level leaders I've ever met, because he naturally pulls his life, and people around him are pulled along. He's not pushing anyone. And that pushing might look like I've got a bandage up my my staff guy, cause he's all broken up. There's some pastoral work there, but Bill is a terrible pastor. He just doesn't pastor. He's just like, well, I'm moving along, and if you wanna keep up, come on, I'm gonna go have a Bible. And you're like, well, I broke a wrist, I'll just patch myself up and go on. And pulling, yeah, so I try to get pastors away from pushing their organizations to pulling their organizations. And I think an organization is the model to do that, and I think you see that in the Bible. Yeah, with Moses, but also I think with the apostles and the disciples when they started to build layers of people who would manage the tables so that they could devote themselves to prayer.
Right.
So I think they were engineering themselves to stay in their wheelhouse, stay in their sweet spot, right?
So good.
And when you collect, when you have a lot of people following you, and I don't think anybody, you guys, mom and pop ministers know this far better than I, because I engineered from the inside an organization. I never had a pastor at church. Does that make sense? So I totally respect anyone in the mom and pop model. But to answer your question, I would say find ways in areas, maybe in the children's ministry or maybe in the worship ministry, find ways to begin to engineer and then budget plans around it so that you can begin to pull those areas and you're not having to push along. I know one guy, he's the worship leader, he does the announcements, he does the message, of course, and then he greets people at the end of the back door. And I'm like, what is everybody else doing? And that's one of his complaints, is I can't find anybody that will take stuff on. And I'm like, man, I don't know how to answer that, but we need to fix that. Someone else? Yes, sir.
So you started there as a denominational.
Yeah, we were Assemblies.
What did it look like transitioning out of that? And was that tough? Did the denomination own the building, and
Oh, yeah.
how did that work?
So technically what was going on is, for the assemblies, they have several varieties of bylaws, but our bylaws were, the congregation owns the building, which is unique, because a lot of denominations own the building and let you occupy it. We owned the building, but we made promises to adhere to the, we agreed to be in the denomination that tongues was the sole evidence of Holy Spirit, being filled by the Holy Spirit. And other varieties, but that was the big problem for us, because we just didn't, I need to be careful here, because I'm the accountant, I'm not a theologian. I don't actually know. I know that I don't think that's true. I think the Holy Spirit can do whatever he wants. If he, So this is just me thinking that. And I come to find out, apparently the whole staff, senior team thought that too. And, but what happened is when Bill replaced Ray, it was Assembly's pastor for Assembly's pastor, so there was no problem. When the organization was falling, the denominational support just didn't really show up. So there was some bitterness starting to grow in the board, Bethel's board, not really in Bill, because he didn't care, because he was independent. I'm going to have revival, right? So when the organization grew, Assemblies was like, hooray for you guys, you made it. And we were like, who are you? We made it because we're going to go have revival. And so there was this disconnect, not really bitter, just ambivalent. Like, I don't really know who you guys are. But then as Bethel began to grow in its influence, what happened is people began to associate, they began to define Assemblies based on what Bethel was doing. Because they would go, well, Bethel believes in the holy laughter. Or, I don't know what we actually did, to be honest. We just were having fun. But they would say, Bethel's falling down, or Bethel's following the Toronto thing. And that is what Assemblies is now getting into. And so that information was streaming into the different Assemblies governmental departments. And they were going, no. So they were constantly defending themselves against this Bethel influence. So what happened is the tail began to wag the dog, is what happened.
Yeah.
And that grew hotter and hotter and hotter until they felt compelled to come, probably like Vineyard did for Toronto, felt compelled to come and say, you guys need to stop doing this because we don't agree with it. And, you know, and that just didn't play with Bill. Because Bill being quiet, but he does have a big stick, and he's like, yeah, we're not gonna do that. And they were going, well, what are you gonna do? And he said, well, actually, we're gonna unvote ourselves off the island. We're just gonna leave. But we will continue our percentage support of the Assembly's denomination.
Wow.
Which was like, they were like, what are you doing? You can't do that. We're about divisions, you know? Either with us or not. You can't leave and honor us. So it was really weird. And Bill had really, so what we found is at the highest level of the assemblies, the men up there, and women too, I mean, I don't know who's leading those, but they would privately meet with Bill and were completely supportive. There was organizationally, in the highest end, there's some beautiful leaders in that denomination. And they were just like, we love what you're doing, but we can't do it because we are a different thing. And we can't associate with you if you're going to do that. And so when it came down to this one point, will you agree that tongues is the sole,
The initial.
yeah, how you prove that the Holy Spirit has filled you? And Bill and the senior team, and we took it to a vote of the organization, what do we think? And the answer was, no, we don't. And we're not even saying you're wrong. We're just saying we don't have an opinion about that. That is not a thing for us. We're not going to fight on that mountain.
Yeah.
So we took a vote, and they sent a team, and they were a beautiful team, and they just came from assemblies, and Bill promised to stand up. There's a general meeting, so there's at that time probably 350 of us in here. These are all the voting members. So the organization membership, and then there's attendees, and then there's voting members, and it's quite small in Bethel. Probably now it's probably nearly 1,000 now, but they would probably claim there's 8,000 people in Bethel. I don't know, but I think I've heard that. So anyway, we had our voting group, and Bill got up. He said, we're going to hear from our brothers tonight from the assemblies. We were going to take a motion. We're going to hear him. We're going to take a motion to either stay or go, depending on what he says, and you guys decide, and I will not engage. So Bill sits down. They get up, and they didn't set it up in advance either. They didn't coach the congregation, which I was like, how did they do that? You know? They literally, Bill just didn't, I'm not going to say a thing. And so we did it. And the time came, and those guys got up, and they just gave a beautiful plea about the amazing organization that it is. The Assemblies is amazing. You know, their missions is unparalleled. Just on and on about who they are, what they believe, how they want us to be part, and they want to run together. And we'd like to take a vote. And so we, I forget who ran that vote, but it wasn't Bill, got up and we took a vote. And I think we had 2 or 3 nays out of the whole room. I think it was 2 or 3. So it was passed as a congregational motion that we would leave the Assemblies of God and no longer associate ourselves with that denomination. We would then become an independent organization, an independent church, and we'd come up with our own bylaws, which we did. And Chris was really involved in that, and he engineered all that legal stuff with the help of our attorneys. I wasn't involved in that. And
Did you have to get a new 501c3?
we did.
Like,
Yeah.
Okay, so all of that was new?
Yeah, all of that, we closed, shot the old one and born a new one, and new bylaws, and Chris, I honestly, I don't understand them all, just because I don't think in these terms, but Chris really did a ton of research, his own credit, around biblically how the elders and deacons and all this stuff works, and he engineered some stuff, and I think it's unique, but maybe not, I don't know. I don't know if we had any models we followed, except the Bible, and he came up with some stuff. With the help of our attorney, we made sure it tied with California law, launched the thing, and then Bill said, what we want to do is continue, to me, it was, we are going to continue our monthly pledge. Now, what that means is at one time, assemblies are supposed to tithe 1/10 of their plate to assemblies. And we had stopped doing that years before, and I think we were tithing 1% of our plate is how it actually worked out. So the organization of Bethel does a 10th calculation on plate income. Now realize, there's a lot of other streams that are not taxed, or not tithed on. Like school ministry is not part of this calculation, and that's millions of dollars. Bethel Music is not part of this calculation. So it's quite narrow, it's plate income. We said we're gonna take 10% of that, and we're gonna give it away to a collection of valued organizations like Global, oh gosh,
Global Awakening?
yeah, Global Awakening, and some big players like Dick.
Ivers. What?
Dick Jones?
Well, I can't think of these guys' names anymore. Dick Joyce was one. No. Anyway, some of these. Yeah. Dick Van Dyke.
That's why there's a new Mary Poppins.
Yeah, right, that's right. Anyway, players that were perceived by Bill and the senior team as these are kind of our apostolic leaders. These are the guys we follow and listen to. And one of those was the assemblies. And the reason was Bill said, we are standing on their shoulders, and so we are going to honor them until death do us part. So in there, one of the organizations actually I remember now was the Wintu Indians,
Wow.
because we honored the original tribes of Redding. And so there was some ceremony that happened, this goes way back, but that was a commitment forever. In other words,
Wow.
it was until death do us part type thing. So we had them, Randy Clark, I wish I could remember these guys. Anyway.
How about Heidi?
Heidi Baker, probably.
Yeah, Heidi Baker and her ministry was really different in one regard, is we literally did a wedding, which I'm not sure what all that was about. But we literally wed these two organizations. We actually had a ceremony around, we are connected to support, determined to support the Iris Ministries forever. So, I don't know that it mechanically makes much difference, but it was kind of a neat ceremony. But anyway, we ended up with continuing to support the assemblies, and I'm sure they still do today. But we ended up with an organization that was just an independent church. And so then we had this dynamic that came up of, and this predates it a hair, but it still continues, is we want to now push information out, support out into whoever wants to follow us, and that we'll call Global Legacy. So you know about this. So then the discussion was how do we build an organizational network that is not another denomination?
Right.
And I think to Paul did many great things. He was an amazing part of the team. He still is. But probably his high point in my perspective was how do we build this Global Legacy thing without creating a denomination? And he pioneered that. And I think he did a fabulous job. Now, he's not running that now. He's doing some other things. Still connected, but he's, of course, doing it over in Europe. But still on staff. He's still a paid member of the team. And he works just in the European arena. So we have a lot of international people, which another reason why it's an organization that's being nimble, but sometimes the nimbleness creates so much complexity. If you can imagine trying to figure out payroll rules in all these different places of the world, not to mention the states.
Yeah.
So, we've got a team down in South Africa. Last I remember, there was a team in South Africa. There was Paul in England. We've got a handful of people. No one else.
Ben Fitzgerald, is he?
He is independent, but just kind of like a sent out person. And then if he has an event, they'll sponsor it. They'll either write a check and support it.
So they'll underwrite.
Yeah.
What
And one of the biggest ways they can underwrite someone like Ben is when Ben puts on an event, send Bill or Chris. Because when Bill shows up, probably he's I think for quite a few years now, at least 10 years, last 10 years, he's the #1 Christian speaker in the world.
Yeah.
Really? Well,
Yeah, I can't think of anybody else like that.
How about Chris Overstreet and this last Portland thing? Of course, we're somewhat familiar.
Yeah, so Chris resigned from the team and moved to Oregon. And he feels called to have revival crusades all around the United States. And he felt his first effort was in Portland. So that's what pulled him out of the team, with good relationship, but he was sent out, he landed in Portland, which is perfect for him, because his wife has a baby, and that's where her family is. So there were more than just the Portland
Sure.
thing, but it was a perfect fit. So now they've had that Portland event, and the way that was underwritten was Bethel basically managed the entire chunks of all the security. I think they did all the security except for inside event. I think they had hired a team for security in the stadium at the event. But all the other security was handled by Bethel and our team, their teams. All the administration, all the registration, and probably underwrote it, but wasn't necessary because the thing really took off. Really did well. Yeah. And of course sent, I know it was Bill, but was it Chris? Probably.
I don't think Chris was there. But
Okay. Yeah, so to have Bill or Chris, who's also very, very, is a tremendous draw. But Bill there's nobody hotter than him right now. And so when he goes anywhere, it's just, he's gonna make it work. Yeah, Bill's popularity is staggering. The influence of that guy is unbelievable. And we just had a celebration for Chris Valentin for his 20 years at Bethel. And they had people just get up and share how he affected, and it was interesting to hear the echoes of how, Chris affected me, but when I hear about Chris Valentin and all that he's doing, I realize that all came from Bill. Bill pulled that dude, messy as he was, out of the crowd and just started working with him. Danny Sill, me, the influence Bill has, he and his wife, Benny, is phenomenal, generational, it's amazing. He'll be written about.
Yeah.
He and Heidi.
Well, quick question, kind of redirection.
Yeah.
You'd mentioned organizational, moving into institutional. How do you see that impacting moving forward with?
Well, I'm not part of the team and in any of their conversations now anymore. I had a not so pleasant reality I had to face about, let's see, this is January, so about a month ago. So in December, I was, so the way it worked is when I resigned, I was sent, they gave me an office, I have a nice little office that I work in, but I was given no responsibilities in an organization. But I'm still invited to attend senior meetings and staff meetings. And I did that for probably the first year and a half. And, but it was awkward, I'll admit. In those meetings, it was awkward for me to sit there because some of the directions they're taking and decisions they're making, I don't value. And it doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm not saying I'm right at all, because I'm not part of the conversation. I'm just saying that when they're talking about things they're doing, I'm like, I don't really have an opinion, and if it is, it's probably negative. So I was very quiet in those meetings. So around December, the car fire happened. So that was in September, August.
Yeah.
So in August, we had the car fire, which is just a big fire in Reading. No big deal, but it was a big deal. But anyway, that happened, and they canceled all the meetings for that event. For about 2 months, there were no meetings whatsoever. So by November, I start wondering, are they meeting now? But I didn't have any invitations. By December, I texted Chris and I said, I'm not getting my invitations anymore. And his response back was kindly, but you don't have any responsibilities on the team, so I don't think it makes sense for you to be in these meetings. And I had to process that. That felt like a big loss for me. And yet, culturally, that's how it works. If you're not on the field, in a position, ready for the ball, you're not on the team. And it's not a performance thing, it's a presence thing. And so, you know, I felt a loss over that. But the reality is I'm not part of that conversation anymore. So when you ask me, and I can give you my thoughts, but I don't think it's fair to the real leadership and the spirit of what's going on in Bethel. So, I mean, I'm happy to offer if you want any more, or any other question that someone has.
I think just my perspective of it, I'm just seeing it's just the logistics of what happens as they are growing. Is that one of the
Yeah.
reasons they'd be going to institutional?
Yeah, I personally think, and this isn't a surprise, they would have heard me say this, so I'm not saying anything that they don't know from my voice. But I believe they're growing the organization to death. I believe they're moving beyond their strength and their stretch to influence culture isn't their wheelhouse, isn't their strength. That's my opinion. And I felt that where you're going isn't sustainable. You remember those old Warner Brothers cartoons with the big body and the little tiny legs? That's what I felt we were moving into back in about 2015, 14, 15. And that's when I began to, I was already in my exit plan. Chris knew about, no, everybody knew about this. You know, I built a 10-year exit plan. And I felt like this organization is shifting. I can sense it. Nobody, to my knowledge, could see it or feel it, but I could feel it. And when I would talk about it, people would look at me like, it's not happening. I'm like, no, it's totally happening, and this bothers me. So that became hotter and hotter as a private discussion between Chris and I. And so I built a 10-year plan, and, you know, Chris would hear it, and he'd go, sure you are, you know. 9 years left, Chris. Yeah, 8, 7. I got to my 7th year, so I had 3 years left, and it was time. I knew. God showed me a runway, and this was miles and miles long. In fact, it was 21 years long. And he said, you are at the end, and you have a choice now to lift off. He showed me very clearly. I saw this. This little plane is me in my ministry. I can lift off, or I can stay on this runway. I'm fine. But I have a choice now, and the choice is now mine. I've done what I needed to do to engineer my departure. But I was done early. Does that make sense? I'm 7 years into a 10-year plan. And this was probably January, I forget, 2015, 16, I guess. Yeah, January 2016. And I explained that to Chris, and I said, I'm going to lift off. Oh, God gave me a caveat. He said, you can lift off, Stephen, as long as you can protect your heart. And it was very clear. And I was, and I knew, and so my paradigm was, oh, I know my heart is right because I know I'm not leaving because I'm not driven away. I'm not mad at them. I feel like this is a different season, and I'm called to this ministry that I want to do, which is sitting right there. And so I can do this. So that was my literal conversation with the Holy Spirit is, I know I can do this. Yes, Father, I'm going to do it. So, I knew I had release. So I went and told Chris. I said, I'm not actually talking about my 10-year plan. I'm actually giving you notice. And he's like, what? You know, you can't do that. And I go, no, I actually have an opinion in this one because I'm telling you, this isn't a discussion.
My life.
And he was like, oh. And up until that time, it had been, no, it's not time. That day I remember, he looked at me and he goes, you know, I think you're right, it's time. And I go, I'm glad you feel that way, because it is time. You know, I wasn't asking. So so we engineered a 6-month plan that's public on how to exit. So I exited in June and continued to be involved in the organization for hours a day. So now I'm independent, I'm unemployed. I'm 50 at the time, I'm 55 years old. And it's like I've stepped off the top floor of a 40-story building and I'm just free falling, right? So I used to think of it as people would ask me, how's it going? And I said, well, it's a little windy. But so far so good, right? So for about 3 months, maybe 4 months, I did this free fall thing, sewing into an organization that I felt loyalty to, right? I was trying to unconnect from my assignment, right? And about 4 months in, I realized no reciprocation was coming. And I had no reason to expect it, but I expected it. So that's when I realized what God said. I gotta keep my heart right, because what lodged in my heart coming about October of 16 was betrayal. I felt really betrayed. Now, I'm not saying I was. I'm just saying this is how I had to deal with this really deep hurt that I feel like I put in 21 years, and you guys just blessed me, gave me the left foot of fellowship, and that was, I'm like, what? You know? So I'm wrestling with this thing, and woo, that was my pivot story that I was talking about, and I can keep going, but I will tell you, unless someone wants to hear the process, I bumped into 3 experiences with the Holy Spirit. One was a grief book, which was a cheesy book written back in the 30s, so it's horrible, but it's all I needed was to realize I was going, so my pivot was a grief process. And nobody told me this, except a friend said, man, you're really grouchy tonight. We were at dinner over steak, and I was speaking farmer tongues. You know what those are? You know, I was just on it. You know, my brother's a great friend. His name's Ray. And he's like, dude, you sound like you're going through grief. I went, what are you talking about? No way. And he goes, well, just read this book. So anyway, I read this book, and it's like a $9 book or something like that. It's ancient. 50 years old. It's 50-year anniversary of this old book. It's called, yeah, really. It's called Good Grief it's written by a Catholic guy. And anyway, I read that, and I realized I was going through grief, and I had to process through grief. So I had that process. And then oh gosh, I was sitting in this, another time I was processing my farmer tongues, I was sitting in my living room with my wife, and I'm just rotten with, you know, my attitude. I'm just rotten. I'm just processing it about it. My wife is, she's with me. She's like, dude, you gotta get over that. That's what God was talking about. I go, I know, but I'm so hurt. And she goes, well, where's Jesus? You know, the whole sozo thing. I've had more sozos than anyone on the planet. So, I've got it down, man. So this is one of my favorite stories, to be honest now. So you'll recognize this from last night. I was sharing pieces of it. This is where it happened. I closed my eyes. Donna's on the couch, and I'm standing across the living room and by the fireplace, and I said, Father God, where are you? Show me where you are right now. Just like I did last night. But this is the first time he ever showed up like this. And I swear, I saw him standing right beside me on this little half wall thing with his arms crossed, and he's leaning against the wall. He's just very casual, he's just standing. Father God, he's just standing. But he is completely dressed out as king. I mean, he is, boom. I was just stunned. And I remember I saw him, and I jerk, and Donna goes, what is it? And I go, oh my God, I see him. And he says, what's he saying? And I go, well, Father, what do you say about this? And he says, he's very relaxed, he says, it's enough that I am.
Wow.
In other words, you don't need an answer because I am. And I'm sobbing, and Donna says, what's happening? And I tell her, and she's crying, and I'm crying. And I realized, oh, forgive me, God, how did somehow I forgot that this isn't about me. I'm so embarrassed about this, but it's true. I was like, rah, rah, rah. And God's like, I'm not even answering that. Get over it. Tape yourself up. And I mean, it just orients my philosophy or my theology that God is sovereign, man. And I know that we all know this, but I mean, and I've never experienced such a gentle, powerful reorient than that. That with the grief book, was some other thing that happened which just lose my mind, but it wasn't nearly as profound as that moment in the living room, man. It's still just, I love it. When I think about Father God, I see him there in that now. And he is frightening, powerful, and completely sovereign, sweet. We have, and it's just, and so that was in December, a year ago. I went, okay, I get it. So January 17th was when I felt like, okay, I made it. I won't lie, I can get triggered. There are things that happened the other day. There was some ceremony going on, and I was hurt that I wasn't part of it. In fact, they felt it too, and they apologized and I wish I could have been, or I wish you did, and forgot. I get it, but I'm not on the team anymore, so I still have those things that can. It's like a sore spot. If you poke it, I can react, but I can tell. I made my pivot. I made it through the shift, and I kept my heart right. So now I feel like, wow, I've got the wild blue yonder. I've got to figure out, and this is what I'm really into. I absolutely love it. I've got a lot of philosophies about it. Josh runs with me in it. Without this guy, I'd have been probably better off. No. I just had to. It's not true.
That's it, I'm done.
Oh, man.
Let's go do it.
Josh, Josh is a gift to me. He and his wife Holly, they're a gift to me. He's got a creative mind. He's got beautiful artistic skills that he carries, but he's also got a very great business mind and great strategist. And we just I love our time. Super fun chemistry. And but my weakness is so one of my skill sets is long vision. And my problem is I am weary of doing the tactics. And so I'm probably lazy with tactics. And so that's a growth thing that I've got to figure out. I'm still growing in that. But I have to say, Josh is truly a gift to me from God. I'm so grateful to you, Josh. Thank you so much for your time and patience. And plus he represents a younger, this is important for us because I know that we all have a lot of gifts. And some of you guys are my age or maybe older. Some of you are not. But I just realized the relevance of our message has to reach into this millennial generation. We have, and they're a weird group, but we have to speak to them. We have to do that. And we do, or we're irrelevant.
Yeah.
Now Josh is, I think you're not a millennial. I think he's too old to do that, but he can see them. I think he understands.
I'm
that.
still in the millennial crew.
Are you?
Yeah. I look older than I am.
Yeah. So
They can
you
reach
feel,
back.
you feel different than millennials that I run into because
That's good. They're still growing up.
they're still growing up. Yeah. They're growing up. So, but anyway, that's where I'm at now, and super fun, super scary. I'm still in free fall. Won't lie about that. But I've gotten used to the wind, and I keep my hair short, so that's good. And I love it. I love what I'm doing, and I feel like I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I feel like inside Bethel, my message was limited, and outside of Bethel, my message is free. So that's what I hope. Speaking, I want to change the world's dialogue about money. I want to change the way they think about money. The church has got to be. We've got to be super good stewards, and we're scared to death of money. I got to feel that.
We've got a lead in that area,
We do.
and
We
we're
should.
not.
We should.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We're not. And I appreciate that.
And we should be the mind of Christ in this area of power, and we're afraid of it.
Right.
But that has got to end.
Well, your message last night spoke to that reason that we're not leading
Yeah.
in that arena that's so critical to every family on the planet.
Yeah. I believe that too. Thank you. Yeah.
We've probably got time for one more question before we end.
This might be a longer one, but since you're talking about money, how do you look at Luke 16 where Jesus says, the children of the world are wiser concerning money than the sons of the kingdom? And then it says, use your money to gain influence and friends. And how, I mean, obviously that's probably the core of your message, I would imagine.
Yeah. I put that message, I use that passage specifically in the Bound in Spirit section, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Bound in Spirit is a passage out of Acts 20 where Paul says, I'm going to Jerusalem, bound in spirit, not knowing what lays before me. And it's kind of this anthem of what's ahead. I really think that that passage doesn't place, so that steward failed, right? And God kind of says, well, look at this guy, he did a good job because he made friends. You should use unrighteous manner to make friends. But it didn't restore the steward. He was fired. So he was ruined. But he was illustrating something. So I believe that illustrates this idea that money is a power that is required to be our servant. So it is a slave under our feet, and that's the proper position for it, to use it for the kingdom, as we are used by God. So he's our master in money, and we are money's master. And I believe that's the system, the alignment that it should be.
Yeah.
You've got to make money. If money moves to a place of authority in our life, where it makes our decisions, or we make our decisions around our money,
Right.
we are at risk of worshiping mammon, submitting to where we become the servant of money. I think where God says you can't serve God in money, and then turns around later and says, use unrighteous mammon, I think he's saying, it's just a servant, it's just a slave to you. Don't be afraid of it, master it. So, yeah, I usually back into that with this statement, money makes a perfect slave, a terrible master. And just work on that.
So good.
So that piece is addressed in the prosperous soul material, and I think it's, so I got two things over there. I got 1 minute left. I'll just say, there's 3 curriculums over there. They're designed for people like you that want to build stewardship programs inside your churches. The prosperous home, is around the practical budgeting and spending and how you build wealth in a home and build stability. Prosperous soul, the white cover, that's a small group curriculum. If you want to run small groups and have someone kind of in charge of that, they use that, I call that foundations, and that teaches I think 6 main principles out of the concept of prosperous soul. So I see prosperous soul as the footing, and prosperous home is something you build on top of it. If you wanted to go deeper in the foundation piece, then you go to the master course, and that's the black cover over there. So in both the foundations, the white and the black both address the mammon issues, but also the master course goes a lot deeper, goes into poverty and mammon and the structure of the orphan spirit that I talked about last night. Talked about being bound in spirit. Talked about the orphan as an adoption. And then a lot of philosophy ideas and theologies about money. Talk about giving and generosity in the 3rd volume. So, those things. We're done. I'm just going to bless you guys. Is that good?
Yeah.
I want to thank you for this time. Lord, I offer it all to you and ask that you would be pleased. And with things that were pleasing, would you cause it to root and grow in us? Things that were not pleasing, would you wash that away, blow that away like chaff? Because, Father, what we really want is your kingdom come, and we want to hear your voice and no other. We pray this. I bless your ministries. I bless everything you lay your hands to. I pray that God would promote you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Can we thank Steve? I'm gonna pass around offering plate, whatever Holy Spirit tells you to give. Bless you guys. We're gonna be back at 2, and I think you're gonna share more on the prosperous soul this afternoon, or
I was thinking home, but I can just.
prosperous home. So
Things home.
All of it's good. So anyway, you guys, we'll be back at 2 o'clock, and there's materials over here that Josh can sell you if you wanna buy some. Great materials. There's a roast in the oven. Oh, I guess people are. Let's see what we got out here. Smoking some trout. I only brought a bunch of trout. Any questions? I can solve them.
But yeah.
So what's your name? Jeremy. Jeremy. Where's your church? Fort Rock. Okay.
Fort Rock is actually.
Is this still on? Oh, wow. Good drive.
Yeah.